Hey guys, welcome back to my podcast. I hope that you're all doing okay. I hope everyone's been enjoying the sun, feeling good. I hope your years have been off to a good start. Let's get in. I want to get straight into today's topic. No waffle about where I've been because, yeah. Anyway, so today I really wanted to discuss something that I've been noticing for about 2 years but haven't spoken about. And I've seen a few other African girls online talking about this specific topic, and I'm so glad because I just kind of felt like I was maybe just kind of imagining things, but it's nice to see it affirmed. It's nice to see that other people have kind of noticed this trend as well. And yeah, as the title of this podcast episode states, some of you are turning into the aunties that we used to despise when we were younger, and it's very sad to see. And it's also very confusing as well. And I really wanted to just kind of sit down and unpack. So I've been having a think for the last few weeks about this because it's just very strange. I mean, I suppose at its core, people do kind of grow up to become A, a product of their environment, and B, very similar to their parents. So it's not overly surprising, I suppose. But I guess what's surprising for me is the fact that so many of us, and when I say us, I mean kind of African diaspora children and children of immigrants. So like first generation immigrants, that will be people's parents or they themselves who moved to Western countries. Obviously, I'm British, so I'm going to talk from a kind of UK perspective. So people that have moved from the UK, moved from African countries to the UK would obviously be considered first generation immigrants. There are also second generation immigrants. I would be in that category, born and raised in the UK. I feel like even if you moved here as like a young child or in your teenage years, you've still spent enough time here to kind of become like, I don't know, quite accustomed to like Western life, Western culture, and essentially, you know, understand it a lot more. So I think that's where my surprise for this trend comes from, is the fact that a lot of us have been socialized for a very long time, if not our whole lives, in the UK. So how have we kind of 360'd back to becoming versions of aunties that we readily had conversations about? I remember anyway, being a teenager. I also remember a big period of time in the UK around the kind of 2010s time where there was so much content online and so many comedians whose entire shtick basically was impersonating African aunties that we would see within the community and basically making caricatures of them and, you know, honing in on certain attitudes and personality traits that these aunties have and exemplifying it through humor. And, you know, as funny as they were, there was also like an underlying idea of, I don't ever want to be like that, or that these groups of people, these types of women are really, really irritating and just, oh my gosh, I just don't want to turn into that. So that's why it's so interesting to me to now be in my late 20s. I suppose I would be considered like a baby millennial / older Gen Z. To kind of see like so many people my age literally turning into aunties, to the point where I've had to distance myself from a considerable amount of people who have just, they've turned into aunties, they've turned into baby aunties, and I'm just like, oh my gosh. And I sort of like being an aunt, it's got to start somewhere. Do you know what I mean? You don't come out of the womb as an auntie. So I suppose it's not too surprising that these people have turned into that. But it's just crazy to me. It's really crazy. And I want to spend this episode unpacking why that is and where this kind of phenomenon is coming from. And I definitely feel like I've noticed this shift happening around the 25-year-old age mark. I think that kind of makes sense. 25 and onwards tends to be the time where you are properly solidified in your kind of adult identity and, you know, understanding that you are now an adult. You're not a young adult, you're not like an older kind of teenager or whatever, like you are literally an adult, and you have people that are 21, 22 that will look at you as a mature adult. So it definitely does seem to be the time where a lot of people start, and I've spoken about this before, about the late 20s, a lot of people start to kind of panic about where they are at in life, and suddenly life doesn't feel like a little game anymore and things start getting a bit serious, and that can 100% impact the way in which people then choose to alter the path of their life to fit in with what they believe is going to get them to whatever goals that they're trying to achieve. So yeah, I really want to unpack it all. I'm really keen to hear what other people think about this topic and if it's something that they've noticed as well. So yeah, let's get into it. If you're watching this on video, I am going to be looking down at my phone because I've got my notes on there. But yeah, I think the first thing to do before we delve into this topic is really kind of understand what exactly constitutes an auntie, because I don't think an auntie necessarily is always about age. I definitely think that it's like a mindset as opposed to an age thing. And yeah, I always remember this one when I was back at school. So for the second high school that I went to, it was an all-girls school. And I remember in, I think like year 10 or year 9, there was a girl that joined the school from Ghana. And she was what a lot of people would describe as fresh. And, you know, when she kind of moved to the school, she was very, you know, proud to be Ghanaian, proud to be African. And she was very kind of headstrong in the beliefs and opinions and things like that she had. And amongst her kind of personality, one thing I noticed about her was just how judgmental she was. And she used to have a lot to say. So, you know, the school that I went to, like if you were new, people would be interested in you, yeah, but they wouldn't go overboard to get to know you. Like you had to put in the effort to get to know other people for sure. I remember when I joined the school, yes, people were nice to me, but I also had to go out of my way to, you know, kind of sit and understand what the different dynamics are, as you do when you join a new group. And I remember this girl joining, and she basically just kind of bulldozed her way like into kind of understanding everything. And I think what she really lacked when she first joined was an understanding that she had moved into a completely different culture, where even if some of the girls are from the same place as you, or we are all from Africa, we have been socialized in the West, you have been socialized in Africa, and there are things that they're just things that aren't going to run over here. And I remember her, like one of the things that she would always do that I found quite irritating, because there were a lot of people at that school that didn't have time for this girl. Do you know what I mean? They found her just a bit too much. And I was always someone who, I'm nice to everyone. I kind of got time for everyone. I felt a bit bad for her as well. So, you know, I made quite good friends with her, and we'd often like get the bus together and talk. And I remember her always, you know, judging like the length of my skirt. That used to be something that really she could not wrap her head around. And one thing about me, I love a short skirt. I'm going to wear a short skirt that barely covers my bum. I absolutely love it. I've always loved a mini skirt. And it was never to impress boys, because we went to a girls' school. There was no boys to impress. It's just what I've always liked, a little skirt. That's a bit of me. So yeah, this girl always used to have just such an issue with my mini skirt. So she'd always bring it up. She'd always have something to say. And eventually it just got to the point where I had to tell her straight up, like, just shut up about my skirts. Like, if you want to wear your skirts down to your ankles, you do that. If that makes you feel comfortable, you do that. I don't say anything about that to you, so please stop talking about the length of my skirt. It's boring. And she got the hint and she stopped. But I do remember one time where she was kind of getting a little bit upset that she wasn't, I suppose, assimilating into the kind of culture as much as she wanted to. And she kind of felt a bit distanced from the other girls in the year group. And she would ask me kind of straight up, you know, do other girls have a problem with me? I feel like sometimes I annoy them, or I feel like sometimes they're laughing at me a little bit. And I kind of had to explain to her, like, yeah, you know, all of that judgy behaviour that you've got going on, like, it doesn't really run here. Do you know what I mean? Like, one thing about the UK is it's very multicultural, and the school that we went to was multicultural. It was the first time for me as well. I was someone who grew up going exclusively to Catholic schools until I moved to that school. So it was the first time that I also had to understand that other people come from different cultures, from different religions, and that kind of judging people excessively is going to make them not really want to be around you, you know. And I appreciate that you come from your culture where, you know, you grow up in a country, everyone's black, most people are Christian, everything's the same. But over here, it's not really like that. And people don't really like feeling like they are constantly being judged or looked down on by people. And, you know, I think eventually she got it. She was all right after a while. But yeah, I do find that to just be an inherent part of like that kind of auntie mindset, is constantly judging people, and just, yeah, to just an extreme degree where it's like, if someone is not doing something personally to you and it doesn't involve you, leave them alone. Like, you don't actually have to have an opinion on everything. Another thing, I suppose, is just this obsession with kind of marriage and respectability as well. I find that a lot of aunties, a lot of these toxic aunties, they're just obsessed with that. You know, you hit 15, 16, 17. Oh, when will you marry? The jokes about marriage starts. And by the time you get to your mid-20s, like, it's not a joke anymore. They are serious. Like, what's going on with marriage? Rah, 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 rah. And again, like, this kind of behavior, it does kind of start a little bit young. Like, I remember being in my early 20s, and it just was like a running joke amongst my friends that, like, oh, you know, I can't really see you ever getting married. I can't see you getting married. And at the time, I used to think that they meant as in, out of all of my African friends, I would say that I definitely dated the most. Like, I was the one who adopted the kind of Western attitudes towards dating. You just date guys and see where it goes and things like that. So I was always the one most open to dating, but I also was quite picky with like guys. Like, for me, there was a clear separation between guys I would date and guys that I actually was like, oh, I could actually see myself. Do you know what I mean? And I used to think that these friends of mine would say things like that to me because of that reason. But as I got older and I look back, I realized that what they were actually trying to say is they didn't feel like I was behaving in a way that would make me an attractive future wife to the type of guys that they were interested in. And it was actually quite a backhanded compliment that they were trying to give me. Obviously, things got a bit quiet when I then was engaged at 24, and a lot of these girls were still chronically single or chronically still in situationships with trash guys. All of that stopped, but I found that very funny that, you know, the people that were obsessed with marriage and believed that they were behaving in a way that would put them first in line for marriage and all of that kind of stuff, exactly find that happened in that way for them. And someone like me who wasn't obsessed with marriage and was actually just having fun and doing what I think a lot of girls should be doing when they're in their late teens, early 20s, was actually the one who ended up finding someone to settle down with. And yeah, I think in general, anything that you obsess over too much, you kind of tend to not get it because you're putting it too much on a pedestal that it doesn't really belong on. And yeah, I feel like with a lot of aunties, they're just obsessed with marriage and motherhood as well. You then get into the relationship and that's not enough. When are the babies coming? You get married, that's not enough. When are the babies coming? You have one child, that's not enough. When is the sibling coming? Just an obsession and just a centering of men and babies and motherhood in life. And I think growing up in the West, obviously, where you know, we're taught more about like feminism and things like that, a lot of us are taught and brought up to be very, you know, career driven and getting an education and getting into a good career and being able to sustain yourself, because by doing those things, you put yourself in a better position to not have to accept any old guy that comes along because you need someone to financially support you. Actually, you can decide to be with someone because you want to be with them and because they actually benefit you in some way beyond having to provide for you and having to rely on them as well, which is something that I feel a lot of older aunties, they don't really understand that because they have grown up in a time and a culture where women were being raised to be prime brides and wives for men. So yeah, sometimes there's a disconnect between like not really understanding that a lot of young girls these days aren't really aspiring to marriage or any old marriage in that way. I find another thing that they do is kind of policing younger women's choices in life and their desire for independence. And critiquing them at a disproportionate rate to the way that they will critique men as well. And again, being back at school, I remember being friends with a girl and I would spend a lot of time at this girl's house. She was lovely because, you know, my house was shit. I used to hate being at home. So I would spend a lot of time at this girl's house. And one thing that I found really, really interesting was so she would get back home from school and she was the only girl in her family. I believe she had like 3 or 4 brothers, and it was just her, the only girl, and her mum. And it was solely her responsibility to cook in the house, to clean in the house. And this to me was fascinating because for all of my dad's faults, one thing that I will say about him is he was very, very well home trained. He could cook very well, clean very well. And growing up, my brother did just as many chores as I did growing up. It wasn't seen as a girl's thing to do chores. It was more so a life skill. You need to know how to do these chores. So to go into this kind of girl's house and see kind of how her house was crazy to me. Like, she would have to do everything. And, you know, a family of 6, 7 is no joke, having to clean, cook, do the dishes every day. Like, oh my. And I remember saying to her one time, like, this is crazy. Like, do you not get like, you know, sad, or do you know, what do you feel about having to kind of do everything basically? And she basically kind of just understood that was just the culture that she's from, and that is the role that women are expected to play in her culture, that, you know, that's just her job. And, you know, her and her mum would kind of just do that. And I would sit there and watch her brothers run in and out of the house. They would be allowed to go out until whatever time they wanted. She had a very strict curfew. They would probably have girlfriends and things like that. She absolutely was not allowed to have a boyfriend or anything like that. And yeah, I find that in a lot of African cultures, that is quite common, where, you know, the boys are allowed to be as reckless as they want, do whatever they want, whereas the girls, it's kind of, no, stay at home, be good, behave yourself, be demure, be quiet, don't do too much. Like, that was very much how she was was kind of raised to be. And yeah, I've always found that kind of, quite interesting. And I find that with a lot of aunties and older women, the types of girls in the community that they will praise are often the girls that embody those types of attitudes or values of being like, very kind of home trained and, knowing instinctively to be the ones to tidy up after the men and bring the food out. And all of that part of like African culture always makes me cringe, because there's just no way in hell. And as I said, maybe my situation was quite unique in that I was raised to see men as also people that need to be able to cook and clean as well. So I remember dating a lot of guys and just not really being interested in them if they couldn't cook or clean. Like, I didn't find it funny at all. I found it really off-putting. And I also saw this kind of behaviour embodied in a lot of girls when we all went off to university, where a lot of girls at uni would see it as like a flex. They would flex to guys about how well they could cook. They would invite boys round to their uni dorms and cook like elaborate chicken stew, plantain, a goosey, like all of this serious African food for them to show them that they were girlfriend material. And fair enough, if that's your boyfriend, that's your man, fine. But most of these girls were in situationships. These were not their men. These were just guys that were basically using them for food and sex, and they didn't clock that. And on the contrary, for me, I remember when I used to date when I was younger, I would pretend that I didn't know how to cook. Like, it was a running thing that I would do. I would absolutely pretend that I didn't know how to cook. And a lot of these guys would think that they would try and like tease me and belittle me and be like, haha, like, you don't know how to cook. That's crazy that you don't know how to cook. I'd be like, yeah, it's crazy. Like, I'd let these boys think that I ate like beans on toast 24/7, because there's no way I'm like slaving away in the kitchen. You think I'm going to stand there using my money to buy very expensive African ingredients to sit and make you traditional dishes for what? Like, you're not my man. Why would I do that? Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I remember when I got with my fiance, and I just felt really happy that I could finally actually flex my cooking skills properly, because yeah, like I said, I'm not going to do that for guys that are not my man. And I don't think that any girls or young women should, but in a lot of African cultures, being able to do that, be a good cook and show that off, is seen as, you are a proper woman, a good girl type thing. Another common trait I would say of aunties is this kind of internalized misogyny that is disguised as wisdom. So, they'll share kind of perpetuating very traditional women's roles and, ideas of how women should be. And when you really pick apart what they're saying, it's essentially just how to make yourself more attractive to men, how to keep a man, how to keep your husband, how to make your husband happy. No. And it's like, is this wisdom or is this just misogyny? And that's something that I find very consistent, and sometimes why I used to doze off a lot when I'd be around certain aunties, and they'll really sit there and really think they're putting you onto game, and it's, for me, in one ear, out the other. That life for me sounds like prison. That sounds like hell. I don't want to be anything like you. I don't want anything like your marriage. Like, please stop talking to me about that, because it's not appealing to me. I'd say another thing as well is just a general disdain for any sort of autonomy or independence that young women will have over their lives. A lot of older African women really don't like younger women who are very outspoken. That is seen as a negative trait for a young woman, to be someone who is too opinionated. And, for someone like me, as you can imagine, that used to get me into a lot of hot water sometimes with certain aunties, where they just didn't like the fact that I would always ask questions. For me, if something just sounds crazy, I'm going to ask about it. Like, I'm not going to sit here nodding my head to something that just sounds ridiculous. And yeah, a lot of aunties would say to me, oh, you're not going to find a man if you're always questioning him and always doing this. It's like, ugh, I don't want one then. Do you know what I mean? I don't want one. I don't dream of men like that, please. And another one that I noticed that is also very common as well is kind of treating suffering as this like weird badge of honor. Because, don't get me wrong, like, I do have a lot of empathy for a lot of African women, knowing what they must have endured as young women and not really having the freedom to kind of maybe pursue any goals or dreams that they had, because they were pushed towards, settling down at a young age and becoming mothers. But I find a lot of them will almost romanticize or just push this idea of struggle being an inherent part of like womanhood. And they'll sit there and they'll tell you all these tales about, me and my husband or me and your uncle, we had to come over a lot of hurdles together. And 9 times out of 10, the hurdles, that they are talking about will be like cheating, incessant cheating. And that is something that they will try to convince you is normal. This kind of idea of men will be men, all men cheat. It's something that you kind of have to like turn a blind eye to or become comfortable with or find ways to deal with. And they often kind of resent young women for wanting an easier life or deciding that they don't want to just suffer along with that as a kind of an inherent part of being a woman, and actually they want to reject that. This idea as well of being in a relationship or being married and discouraging things like divorce because of how it will look externally, despite the fact that, this woman is being disrespected constantly or is very unhappy in the marriage. They will push those things as just an inherent part of marriage. Oh, if it's not this guy that does it to you, it will be the next one. You might as well just deal, the devil is better than the devil you don't. Those kind of ideals, which I find very, very toxic, but something that I find, and I suppose it's almost like a bitterness there as well. Like, if I had to go through this, then I'm going to tell you about it as well so that you can go through it too. And there's almost a resentment when they see young girls actually choosing themselves, pushing back marriage or deciding to have children at a later age when they're more stable or when they're further along in their career where they can choose to do that. That seems to be something that just breeds a lot of resentment in auntie types as well. And so, obviously I was having a think about why this phenomenon happens. Why do so many African diaspora girls raised in the West, born in the West, grow up and then around their mid-20s kind of have this kind of switch? Like, why is that? And I feel like even though a lot of us do grow up in the West, there is still a strong you do still feel the weight of African traditions and adhering to those African traditions for sure. And, really when you think about it, you kind of still have 50-50, because at home, you will be living a very African life. You eat African food, you can participate in African traditions and culture, and it's only outside of the home really where you are kind of westernized. So I suppose as you grow up, it's quite 50-50, do you know what I mean? And a lot of young Africans, once they finish university, a lot of them will go back to live in the family home as well. So even kind of leaving the house at 18 doesn't necessarily mean that you are fully removed from that culture enough where you will begin to develop your own ideas of what you want to do as you get older, because 9 times out of 10 you will find yourself back in that environment and still immersed in that culture enough for it to influence you, and you will begin to see your peers and other people around you also kind of adhering to those social standards that are expected of them and pressuring you to also do the same. Church is also somewhere where a lot of these ideas about what it means to be a good African girl are, reiterated. A lot of African Black people go to kind of stereotypical African Black churches as well, where the idea of getting married, priming yourself for marriage, looking forward to marriage are heavily, heavily pushed. So again, even if they are westernized and living in the Western world, at home they have this kind of pressure, at church they have this pressure. Those are spaces where the ability to be influenced by what is expected of you is very high. So I also feel like, just in general, as I said, the older you get, the more pressure you feel to conform to what is going on around you, which is quite interesting for someone like me. I've mentioned in episode 2 that obviously I dropped out of university when I was 18. It's also around the same time that my dad stopped speaking to me as well. My mum obviously passed away when I was quite young. So from 18 onwards, I have just been out in the world kind of figuring it out myself. And there's definitely been pros and cons to that. I'd say the biggest pro is being able to develop my own kind of value system and my own moral code for what I believe or how I want to live my life and how I see it right to live my life. And actually being able to have distance through living by myself from the kind of African community and culture has allowed me to very much make decisions and have opinions and choices that are very much my own and not really influenced in the same way that I've seen, friends or family friends have to kind of adhere to pressures that perhaps are not their own. And I remember being in my early 20s, before I started my professional career when I was 22, I used to work full-time in retail, and I worked in a big department store on Oxford Street. And when I joined, probably about a few months later, there was a Ghanaian girl that also joined. And in hindsight, I was very much warned about this girl. Like, you know, a lot of the older women at the job would always encourage me to stay away from her. They thought she was very, very weird. Me and my naivety at the time, I was like, no, like, she's just a fun, cool girl. Like, you don't know her. Like, I know her. Like, she's fine. They were absolutely right about this girl. Like, she's turned out to be so weird. So weird. And I've always been someone who enjoys being very glam, like literally how I am now. I've not really changed through my 20s. I've always kind of enjoyed doing my hair and makeup and things like that. And especially to come to work because I worked in central London, and because it was a big department store, you would have people from all over the world that would come, and I just enjoyed looking nice. The dress code for the shop that I worked at was like business wear, so I would spend a little bit of money on, you know, nice cute little blazers and tops and blouses and skirts, and I used to dress nice to work, always had my hair done and stuff. And I remember this girl when she joined, she was very much one of those kind of natural hair warriors, and she used to always, like, you know, make little comments at me like, oh, I bet it takes you so long to do that hair and makeup every day, those kind of things. And I'd just be like, no, it doesn't. I enjoy doing it, and I've been doing it for a long time now, so it takes about half an hour. It's not that long at all. Together for a while, and we kind of became friends, and then we both left working there, and I stopped kind of speaking to her as much, because as I spent more time with her, I began to understand what other people said about her. She was a very, very odd and shady girl. When we left, we would speak to each other kind of via social media. She was very much a stereotypical South London black girl. If you've ever known a black girl from South London, you'll know what I mean. Like, very kind of, you know, boisterous, like one of those types of girl. And she was very, very westernized as well. You know, I remember us talking, and, you know, one time she started talking about like a wedding. And I was so confused because, to the best of my knowledge, she'd never spoken about a man. She'd never spoken about like anything to do with a boyfriend or even anything like that. And I remember at first asking her questions about like the guy. I'd be like, oh my God, like, you know, wedding, congratulations. Like, you know, who is he? Like, where did you guys meet? Like, show me some pictures. And she was acting really, really weird about the whole thing. Like, she never sent any pictures. And eventually I kind of got the hint to, I suppose, stop asking about him, because I don't know if it was arranged. I don't know. The whole thing was just weird. And because of her shady behaviour in the past, and just, you know, she was a bit off, I kind of thought that she might be lying about getting married and this whole wedding thing. But lo and behold, on Snapchat one day, I see that she's having I suppose a Ghanaian equivalent of like a introduction type thing, like a traditional version of the wedding type thing. God, to this day, I don't actually know who she was getting married to or where she met this guy. The whole thing was it was just crazy. And I remember, I think I must have been about 23 at the time, and she was a few years older than me, so she must have been about 27. And you know, the whole thing in hindsight was giving that, you know, she had been pressured to get married, or she felt the pressure to get married, or someone in her family did, and they had arranged like this marriage for her. So she did the traditional, and then I was expecting obviously to see like the white wedding like a few months or weeks or whatever later, and it kind of just never came. And I recall her going very quiet, didn't really see much or hear much from her for a very long time. And then all of a sudden she re-emerged. She had now turned into a middle part, bust down baddie, makeup on fleek, hair on fleek, tits out, legs out. I was like, what has happened to this girl? And by this point we weren't really close anymore, so it would have been inappropriate to ask her like where the hell is her husband, like, what's going on? And she just kind of stopped mentioning him. I didn't see any ring, so I assumed that it got kind of called off, and I suppose she maybe found herself and decided that she wanted to just do her own thing, which I'm happy for her, because, you know, I could always tell by the way that she would kind of tease me about, you know, the fact that I dressed and did what I wanted and did my hair, makeup, things like that. You don't consistently keep pointing out something on someone unless it's something that you also want. You know what I mean? There was part of her behavior that kind of gave like envious-ish vibes, or, you know, wanting to do what I was doing. So to kind of a few years later see her basically like download my whole look and run with it, it was like, oh, okay, interesting, but, you know, good for you, because do what you want to do. Sack off the guy if you don't want to be married, like, do you? And yeah, she did carry on being weird, so eventually I just blocked her. You know, I suppose that was an example of perhaps at one point in her late 20s she did feel pressured to kind of go along with what was expected of her and get married. And I've seen other girls I know, like, you know, get married or get into serious relationships with guys who I don't know if they've 100% chosen them. And, you know, I see a lot of girls these days as well, African girls, really romanticizing this idea of being with guys from the same country as them, and they will go so far as dating like native Africans who are born and raised in Africa. And I find that, as a diaspora kid, very interesting, because, you could be from the same country as someone for sure, but you've grown up in very different ways. Like growing up as a Black African in the UK v growing up as a Black African in your African native country are two very different things. And one thing I noticed from guys who would be interested in me who were like native Africans was that how they expected me to be in a relationship and the things that they would talk about or expect of me were just way too different to what I was like. And I remember dating a son of a kind of oil, I don't know, tycoon. Like his dad was like really big in oil. He's from a very, very wealthy family, and he had a very, very keen interest in me. And I kind of put it off for ages because I just kind of knew we were from very different backgrounds, like he was stereotypical, like Nigerian rich boy. I was born and raised here. Like, it's just not going to work. But eventually I did go on a date with him, and he basically confirmed everything I thought. He was very overly concerned with knowing that I could like cook and, knowing, I remember him telling me like, oh yeah, I think you'd get along with my mum and my sister. And I was like, boy, I don't give a shit whether your mum and sister would like me. Like, I don't care. Like, what the hell am I supposed to feel flattered by that? But that's what I mean is in like the cultural differences that exist there where, I would be expected to kind of slot into his family and make myself appealing to his mum and his dad and his sisters, and they would all need to like me for this relationship to work. And for me, like, that's not going to work. I like to be with men who know their own mind and who have a level of independence. And for me, I've always said I don't really care how much money you have in that way if it's going to mean that I need to then start behaving in a certain way so that I can be accepted by you or your family. And I also don't like men who are overly reliant of their family in that way. Do you know what I mean? It kind of gives those vibes where if he doesn't behave in a way that is acceptable for his family, then he's going to get cut off type thing. And I don't like that. And I've seen girls marry into families like that, where on paper it sounds great. Wow, you've married into wealth. Wow, your life's going to be easy. But actually now you've got an over-involved stepmom who seems to have a lot of sway in the way that your relationship goes. You've got a husband who needs to go to mummy and daddy to ask them for their approval for everything. Like, no. I like men that can stand on their own 2 feet. So it's interesting to me when I see, Western women really kind of, be so pressured to kind of be in relationships, to be in marriages, that they will kind of run to Africa to find men like that. And I don't know, are they truly happy to kind of change themselves a lot or to do things that they might not have been willing to do? Do you know what I mean? But I don't know, everyone's got their different journeys in life. If they're happy to do that, then good for them. Also, when I think of the kind of cultural conditioning that can, force a lot of women to turn into aunties, there's social rewards and cultural rewards that you get for behaving in a certain way as a woman within a lot of African cultures. There's a lot of acceptance that you get from the elders in the community. I've seen this happen where, a girl kind of grows up into her 20s and, suddenly she's the girl that's invited to kind of sit with the adults now. She gets to sit and participate in the conversations that the adults and the women are having because she has shown that she is a good woman and that she is a mature woman and that she is, growing in a way that is acceptable, to participate in that. And for some young African women, that's very important to them. It makes them feel mature. It makes them feel like they are making right decisions in their life when that happens. And at the end of the day, humans are very kind of social creatures in that way. So it's understandable that you will do things that will gain you wider acceptance within the group. And part of that is behaving in ways that are reinforced by the older generations. And, for people and young African women that choose not to go down traditional paths or, take on traditional roles as women, you will find that you become a little bit ostracized, or you will always be seen as the wayward one or the immature one or the one that wants to just do her own thing. Like, you won't be taken as seriously as the girls that, they throw away all of their mini skirts, they don't wear tight clothes anymore, they don't wear weaves or whatever anymore, they only wear braids, or they cut their hair low, and little things like that. You find that you become a part of the adults in the community as opposed to being seen as the kids. And for a lot of girls that is very important to them, so they see what their peers are getting through behaving in a certain way, and they think, well, I'm going to do that too because I want that. The other part of this, I suppose, is the idea of respectability politics and a fear of aging. I always find that I'm always quite fascinated when I see women that are like terrified of aging, and they really see, kind of 25 and up as like geriatric. And I definitely do think like that fear of aging can force a lot of young diaspora women to really, 180 and just adopt a lot of traditional, cultural ideas of womanhood that they may have once rejected. I have seen young African women who see, marriage and traditional roles as a form of security. They kind of fear for their future, and they see that if they behave in a certain way, then they will get certain rewards. I recently watched a film called Hard Truths. If you've not seen it, I would 100% recommend that you do. I believe it came out like last year, but in the UK, it came into cinemas, I think like January time. I watched it in February, and it was such an amazing film. It's always great to see British films that are mainly, Black British cast. I really always enjoy them. The starring actress was Marianne Jean-Baptiste, and she was really amazing in her role. And she basically played an older, she wasn't African. This was based on Black Caribbeans, but I believe from growing up around Caribbeans, I think like an auntie is an auntie, do you know what I mean? And she plays this role amazingly of this older Caribbean lady who is just basically the epitome of an auntie. So judgmental. Like, there are so many scenes, and I've seen people like clip them on TikTok as well, where she is just incessantly commenting on other people and other people's lives. She's just got this kind of inherent like anger within her. Through the film, you learn that it's some of it is to do through grief. Losing her mother in a really kind of traumatic way has affected her a lot, and also being parentified from a young age as well has just caused her to build up a lot of resentment. A large part of the film also follows how her life differs a lot to how her sister chooses to live her life. Marianne's character in the film has a husband who she basically has come to resent, like she cannot stand him, and a son who is in his early 20s, I believe, and just kind of sits around like eating and playing like video games and stuff all day. And she's just fed up. Like, she does everything around the house, she cooks, and he's one of those men that, yes, goes out to earn money and provides for the house. They do live in a nice house in a nice area. They're not struggling for money or anything like that, but that's basically all he does. And I think that kind of actually mirrors a lot of like African aunties I know, where they are married to men that are like, I don't know, like just kind of emotionally tapped out, and I've been to like people's houses before where I've noticed their dads are like this, where their dads are almost just mute, like they just don't talk ever, but they're just there. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Like, they're just there. They don't talk. They're not really overly involved in the lives of their children. They can't tell you like what their children are studying at school because they just don't know. All they know is how to go to work, provide, and that's it. But obviously, in a relationship, and especially the types of relationships that, girls and women my age expect to be in, that is just not good enough. And over time, you want a partner who can meet you emotionally, who can support you emotionally. And there's a scene in there that really kind of sums it up, where Marianne's character is in bed, very visibly like depressed and just unable to cope with life. And the husband comes back from work, and the only query he has about her, not are you okay or what's going on or to comfort her, is will you still be making dinner tonight? And she literally flips out, as she should, because what the fuck? Your wife is crashing out, like she's clearly not herself, and all you care about is dinner going to be cooked tonight. And, there's a scene later on where she's sitting with her sister, and in contrast, her sister is a single mum, and she's got these two daughters who are really vibrant. They talk to her about their nights out. You can tell they've got a really, really lovely close bond. They love their mum. She loves them. They're very open and free around her, as, your kids should be. They're doing well for themselves. They've got good jobs. And she's a single mum. She's been single for a very long time. And, there's a point in the film where her sister asks her, like, why did you get married to him? And Marianne's character basically says that he was just the guy who was there. And on paper, he was a decent guy. He had a good job. He was a decent guy. Why wouldn't she have married him, basically? But obviously now, years and years and years on, she's kind of seeing the reality of marrying someone who doesn't actually provide or add much more to your life other than stability, is that it becomes depressing. It becomes restrictive. You feel like you are not really living and you are just existing. And, you know, that is something that's causing her a lot of like anguish as well, in comparison to her sister, who's just living her best life. And as she says, she doesn't have to keep no man to be happy. She's thriving. She loves her life. She's got a salon business that's doing really well. And I think that, yeah, there is a kind of tendency for a lot of women, regardless of being African, I think women in general are just conditioned to see marriage as the be all and end all of life, and to make a lot of life decisions and a lot of, you know, decisions about themselves and their future with marriage in mind. What is going to secure me? What is going to do this? And I feel like as a lot of African girls get older, they start panicking, and it's like, oh my gosh, you know, I'm no closer to marriage. I've never had a boyfriend before. What am I going to do? And I did see a clip going around recently of a former Love Island contestant. I didn't actually watch this season of Love Island, so I'm not really sure, you know, much about her, but I believe she's Nigerian, and she was basically saying that she's done with her kind of baddie era, baddie look, and that she wants to essentially become more conservative, because dressing like a baddie, in her words, attracts, you know, rappers and trappers, and, you know, there's nothing good that comes from the baddie aesthetic. I suppose what makes it weird is that I believe she's in a long-term relationship already, so it's quite worrying that she's like having these opinions and beliefs. Like, what is her man making her feel like why does she feel the need to change herself? When you think about it, the way she got that guy was by looking like that. So why suddenly does she feel like she's not going to get a ring if she doesn't kind of change herself? And I feel like the words that she said and the ideas that she had, and there were a lot of people that disagreed with her, but also a sizable amount of people that did agree with her. And I have seen a lot of young African women have these ideas where they kind of get to their late 20s and suddenly there's a wardrobe rehaul. Do you know what I mean? They don't want to dress how they were dressing before. They dress very conservatively. The dresses and skirts get longer. The cleavage disappears. And they really kind of want to present themselves as very demure, very conservative. I find that interesting. I definitely do think the kind of fear of aging out, where, you know, a lot of these women begin to attribute their singleness to the way that they are presenting themselves. Like, oh, you know, perhaps if I dress a bit more like this or I act a bit more like this, then I'll be more attractive to the type of man that I want, which I think is sad. I don't think you should ever change yourself or make life decisions based on what you think a man would like. Fuck them. Something else that I've noticed a very big rise of on social media as well amongst young kind of African women is this adoption of soft life and soft life culture, and kind of a push to embrace very traditional ways of being a woman. And I think initially the kind of soft life movement started off as a rejection of this hustle culture and, you know, black women having to go above and beyond all the time to provide for themselves, to provide a certain lifestyle for themselves, to just exist in the world. And it started off quite positive. Like, I was very here for like the soft life, you know, black girl movement. In recent times, I feel like it's kind of developed, though, a bit more, number one, constantly being centered around, you know, men and marriage. And ironically, it's gone from rejecting, you know, things that genuinely are toxic. Yes, I don't think hustle culture is very like healthy at all. And constantly feeling like you have to grind. I don't think that's good. But instead of kind of going to a nice balance, it's then gone back to, you know, pushing very harmful traditional ideas where a lot of women are teaching other women how to prime themselves and prepare themselves to be ideal candidates for men, and that it's the men that are going to provide this soft life for them. And I think on paper it doesn't sound bad, but when you really think about what is being pushed, it's this idea of women again centering men, positioning the idea of marriage as something to put on a pedestal so that you can secure your life, secure your future, and create this soft life for yourself. A lot of kind of young African women and just African women in general I've seen adopt this mentality. It's kind of just going away from the idea of having like independence and basically going back to pushing women to be dependent on men. That's basically what it is. And that is a form of auntie behaviour, because that's essentially what a lot of aunties encourage young women to do, is how are you how are you preparing yourself as a young lady to ensure that you are a positive and strong candidate for men to look at and want to wife you? I.e., can you cook? Can you home make? Are you someone who's going to be submissive? Are you someone who's going to dress conservatively so that your husband isn't embarrassed by what you wear, or that you're not attracting other men? Are you going to be demure and quiet? And, you see this reinforced by men who'll sit there and say, oh, I don't want to be with a girl that has too many opinions. I don't want to be with a chat box. I don't want to be with a woman that's arguing with me. And then on the counterpart of that, you see the women then saying, oh, to be a real woman is to be quiet and to be this. And, it's just basically the new age version of aunties. And I don't think it's ever good to encourage young women to be dependent on men. I think encouraging young girls, I know I've spoken before about university and I didn't go to university, That doesn't mean that I don't believe that education is not important. I 100% always support young people going to university if they have that opportunity and if it aligns with their future goals, especially women. And if it's not university you go to, then you build yourself a career where you can sustain yourself. The idea of, oh, I don't want to work, I'm just going to have my feet up and, wait for a rich man to come along and give me a life. No, that's the worst thing that you can do. And I feel like for me, this is all very interesting to observe because, as I said, I haven't been deeply ingrained in African culture in that way since I was about 18. And I've always been kind of, very kind of independent. And am I in African culture? For sure. I'm still, very much black. I'm from 2 different African countries on opposite sides of the continent. So it's always been very interesting to me to observe from the outside looking in. I feel like it kind of enables me to see these things very objectively. I feel like having to find my way in the world at, a relatively young age means that I have, it means I've taken bits and pieces from, different things to kind of build my own worldview of what I think or how I've developed, into womanhood. I also feel like there is a lot of importance as a young woman or a woman in general in, critiquing and thinking critically about the culture that you are in and what you are raised to believe as right or wrong. Because there is no culture that is just 100% right. And I think the best thing you can do is actually take the best of both. I think it is a privilege to grow up in the West and have the ability to kind of see what life is like in another part of the world and actually mix that in with your heritage and you create a culture that works for you. And I feel like as you get older, yes, you can feel pressured into having a certain life or being a certain way, but there comes a point in adulthood where you need to start making decisions for yourself. And I feel like, as I said before, I've began to kind of distance myself from people who I feel embody the very toxic parts of that auntie behaviour, where it's like, wow, this is actually quite sad. Do you know what I mean? You weren't like that when we were younger, and it's sad to see that you've kind of succumbed to the more negative sides of that auntie kind of behaviour. Instead of, having the strength and having the critical thinking skills to actually be like, I'm not really sure if some of that behaviour is all the way right or correct. I do also think that the difference between, a woman kind of becoming an auntie and not becoming an auntie is, having your own true personal values v doing what is expected of you. And performing basically for social approval as well, because I do find that a lot of girls, young African girls, they kind of go through their 20s always doing what's expected of them, always being the good African girl. They go to church, they don't have boyfriends, they get their studies, they get top grades, they graduate, they get the job, and then they kind of get to their late 20s, early 30s and realize that they haven't actually been living their life for them. And I think the thing about life is that you can definitely do as much as you want to be what you think is a good African girl, but eventually it's going to eat up at you, and especially I think perhaps it's something you can cope with a bit more if you actually live and grow up in Africa, where most of your peers and everyone around you is living that certain type of life as well. But when you grow up in the West and you have more, the ability to see the range of different lifestyles and lives that people live, it's going to get to a point where, you might start to feel a bit of regret at not actually just being your own individual person. And I think that there are elements of African upbringing and culture that don't really encourage young women to become independent individuals with their own minds and their own dreams and goals. And, I find that quite sad, and I've seen the effects of not being an independent person, what that can turn you into. And I don't want that, and when I think of my own personal life, my mum divorced my dad before I was even able to walk or talk, so I don't have a recollection of my dad being in my life before the age of 9 because she made that choice to leave him. And, I'm sure it wasn't an easy decision. It's not. In African culture, divorce is frowned upon, and to be a single woman, a single mother is not something that people aspire to at all. So I don't doubt she had challenges, navigating that. But I will always admire the strength that my mum had to do that, because, it takes a lot of guts. It does. I always have so much respect for divorced mothers who make that decision that they would rather be a single mother, deal with the cultural shame that comes with being a divorcee, deal with the cultural shame that comes with being a single mother, then stay, in a relationship with a man that doesn't respect them, that, abuses them, hits them, cheats on them, or whatever else it is. Like, that takes a lot of strength. And I feel like, for me, that's definitely influenced, me as an individual. Like, I saw my mum as a very strong woman. And as I said at the start, most people grow up to be versions of their parents. And I like to think that I have rejected a lot of traits from my dad, who I don't really consider to be a nice or good person, and that, I've adopted the more positive traits of my mum. So I like to think that I take a bit more after her. And I think to be a girl who grows up in the Western world and choose actively to embody those toxic African traits it's a shame. It's a shame. Like, embrace the facts that you haven't grown up in those very rigid, very patriarchal environments, so that you do have a little bit more autonomy over your life growing up in the West. Embrace that. Stand up to your parents a bit more if they're trying to force you to do something you don't want to do, or a life you don't want to live. You're an adult. Like, speak up for yourself. Yeah, I think I am going to wrap up this episode now. I would love to hear what you guys think about this topic. I will see you in my next podcast episode. Take care. Bye-bye.